Okay, this is a parallel table to the one we looked at before for vector, water, and foodborne diseases. This is a summary of adaptation options for key health risks associated with heat. Okay, key risks: heat-related mortality, morbidity, and mental illness. Actually, heat is also associated with violence, domestic abuse, conflicts, and all sorts of things which are at least indirectly related to mental illnesses. Geographic regions, global, but especially where temperature extremes beyond physical and mental health and thermal comfort thresholds, levels are expected to increase, and there are now maps available for where the combination of temperature and humidity are going to exceed these thresholds. You have to be careful because those are related to dew point temperatures, and it's not clear that there is an end-to-end study of the thermal tolerance. There are lots of assumptions made there as well, but nonetheless, when you look at the global temperature trends, you will see Middle East and the Mediterranean and Central Asia warming really rapidly compared to all the other land regions. So these are the regions which are already pretty warm, and if they get warmer, obviously that's not a good thing. Looking at the consequences that would be considered severe and to whom: substantial increase in heat-related mortality and morbidity rates, especially in urban centers, heat island effect, and rural areas, outside workers, outdoors in general, so sports and related activities, and for people suffering from obesity, weak cardiovascular capacity, or physical fitness. So these are the people who are going to be at increased risk. As for urban heat island and rural, it's generally assumed that urban heat island makes the urban centers worse and rural areas are somehow better, but in India it turns out that some studies indicate that rural areas can actually have higher heat island effect because the agricultural lands are abandoned after the rainy season or the cropping season, and they are sometimes worse off because urban areas have actually taken care of putting gardens and trees and so on. So one has to be careful about generalizing these things. Nonetheless, in general, it is true. Generalize and be careful. Increased risk of respiratory disease and cardiovascular disease mortality. Loss of economic productivity, which is well established, associated with heat. Substantial increase in mental illness compared to the base rate. So if you look at the background state versus where the heat risk is increased, then mental illness does show attributable changes or increases. Hazard conditions that would contribute to this risk being severe: substantial increase in frequency and duration of extreme heat events, especially in cities where heat will be exacerbated by UHI effects. So recently there have been many examples where global warming superposed with El Nino or La Nina have extended the heat wave periods. They have extended the area covered by heat waves, duration and intensity of heat waves, and so on. So it's not just global warming anymore, it's how natural variabilities like El Nino, La Nina, the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, and so on, constructively add to global warming as well. Unintended increases in urban temperatures from anthropogenic heat, so vehicles, air conditioning, urban metabolism. So basically air conditioning cools the room, but it spits out all the heat outside. So if you have lots of air conditioners running, then you're going to have negative impacts as well. These are short-term as opposed to long-term global warming, greenhouse gas impacts of HFCs and so on. Increased number of days with high temperatures in non-urban settings such as agricultural areas. Okay, exposure conditions that would contribute to this risk being severe: large increases in urban heat and population heat exposure driven by demographic change such as aging and increasing urbanization, which is now pretty much irreversible. More and more people are moving into urban areas. 50% live, I think, in urban areas, and this is expected to continue to increase. Exposure will increase amongst agricultural and construction workers who work outside. Vulnerability conditions that would contribute to this risk being severe. So these are exposure, this is vulnerability, and this is hazard. Mortality and morbidity increases in the number of very young and elderly and of those with other health conditions such as lack of physical fitness, obesity, diabetes, and associated comorbidities is vulnerability enhanced risk. Lack of adaptation capacity, mental illness, lack of air conditioning, lack of access to healthcare systems and services. Okay, what are the adaptation options with high potential for reducing heat related disease outcomes? Heat warning systems. Early warning systems really help with the management of heat waves. Improved building and urban design, including green and blue infrastructure and passive cooling systems, acknowledging that not all will have access to air conditioning, so access is important as well as availability. Broader understanding of heat hazard and better access to public health systems for the most vulnerable, so shelters, hydration centers, public transportation, etc. Application where possible renewable energy sources, so that would reduce smog and exacerbation of heat waves with pollution. Communication around drinking water, availability of clean water via simple, effective water purification systems in low water quality settings, and water spray cooling and mental health support as well. Okay, these are the selected key references. Let's add air pollution to this as well and conclude this part. Summary of adaptation options for key health risks associated with air pollution. Often air pollution and heat waves confound each other and make risks much worse. So here key risks are air pollution related health effects. Geographic region, global, but especially in regions with existing poor air quality, particularly in relation to particulate matter and ozone. Greatest climate change driven ozone related mortality expected for East Asia and North America. For PM, the highest climate and air quality related mortalities are projected for India, the Middle East, former Soviet Union, and East Asia. Projections are made on based on some assumptions, so one has to be always careful, but as a risk one must pay attention to it in terms of adaptation options. Consequences that would be considered severe and to whom. Substantial increase in air pollution related mortality and morbidity rates, especially in urban centers, related to both severe pollution episodes and long-term deterioration of air quality. People particularly vulnerable include those with RTIs and so cardiovascular diseases and respiratory tract infections. Increase in mental illness, so depressions as a result of poor air quality and visibility. Hazard conditions that would contribute to this risk, so you have hazard, exposure and vulnerabilities that increase the risk. So non-achievement of emission reduction targets is always a key hazard. Substantial increase in frequency and duration of meteorological conditions conducive to the buildup of both primary and secondary air pollutants. Example, greater frequency of calm atmospheric blocking conditions, and no long-term improvements in air quality at a range of geographical scales, global to local. Increase in frequency and intensity of wildfires and dust storms. Increase in the intensity of UHIs, especially in the summer, and the occurrence of ozone episodes due to anomalous high urban temperatures. So emissions compared with certain heat conditions and humidity conditions lead to formation of tropospheric ozone, which is a deadly pollutant and health hazard. Exposure conditions that would contribute to the risk of being severe. Large increases in the exposure to air pollutants driven by demographic changes such as aging and increases in urbanization. For arid regions, increases in exposure to dust storms, especially in Sahara and desert regions. Areas adjacent downwind of major wildfires, as we saw this summer, wildfire smoke was sweeping down from Canada into much of eastern part of the U.S. For arid regions, increase in exposure to dust storms, areas adjacent or downwind of major wildfires. For urban populations, intensifying urban heat islands and enhanced formation of secondary pollutants, which are chemical reactions happening with available combinations of conditions like temperature, humidity, and other elements. Vulnerability conditions that would contribute to this risk being severe: increases in the number of very young and elderly and those with respiratory or cardiovascular conditions, and lack of adaptation capacity, for example, reduced reliance on solid fuel for cooking and heating, and mental illness, lack of access to healthcare systems and services similar to the heat wave conditions. Adaptation options with high potential for reducing risks from air pollution: air quality management policies, air quality warning systems, efficient and cheap mass transit systems which are critical during bad air days, integrated urban planning including nature-based solutions and green infrastructure, broader understanding of air pollution hazard and better access to public health systems for the most vulnerable like poor, children, elderly, etc., and applications where possible application where possible of renewable energy sources to reduce emissions. And here are the references. Okay, so we are pretty close to wrapping this up, so let's come back and do this one in the next podcast. I have about 6 slides left in this summary of chapter 7 from the IPCC. Okay, so see you in the next podcast.